Okay, I think we can start. I'm Edner Session, the director of the center. And this is the third roundtable of the series on the senses. Today's is on smell, and the next one in 2 weeks will be on sound. Jerry Horowitz, who's the associate director, will introduce the participants, and then we'll get going.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. I have a wonderful list of roundtable participants today, and we're getting very excited about this topic today. So will you raise your hand, please, when I call out your name? Mark Smith is Carolina Distinguished Professor of History and Claude Henry Knopfler Chair of Southern Studies at the University of South Carolina, where he is also Director of the Institute for Southern Studies. He is a Fellow of the Royal Historical Society. Smith specializes in the history of the senses and is author of A Century History Manifesto and editor of Smell and History, a Reader. Claire Batty is Associate Professor of Philosophy at the University of Kentucky and Research Fellow at the Center for Olfactory Research and Applications at the Institute of Philosophy, University of London. Her research interests are in the philosophy of perception and in particular the philosophy of olfaction. She has published numerous papers on the nature of object representation in olfactory experience, including a representational account of olfactory experience and several others. More recently, she has turned to issues of property representation, those of humans as well as other animals, and spatial representation. Her most recent publications include Scent and the Space Between Us, with Barry C. Smith, A World of Odors. She received her PhD from MIT in 2007. James Bauer is a visiting professor of computational neuroscience in the Biocomputation Research Group at the University of Hertfordshire, United Kingdom, as well as an affiliate professor of biology at Southern Oregon University in Ashland, Oregon. He was previously a professor at the University of Texas System at the California Institute of Technology. Dr. Bauer's research in computational neuroscience is focused on the physiological and functional organization of cortical structures in the mammalian brain, including both the olfactory cortex and the cerebellum. He has been actively involved in the development of scientific infrastructure, including the Genesis neural simulation system, as well as founding several scientific meetings and journals, including the annual international meeting in computational neuroscience and summer courses in computational neuroscience in the United States, Europe, and Latin America. Andreas Keller is a New York-based academic with PhDs in neuroscience and philosophy who is interested in olfactory perception. He has over a decade of experience in olfactory psychophysics and the clinical aspects of olfaction. The results of his experiments have shed light on human olfactory capacities, on the relation between the structure and smell of odor molecules, and on the perceptual consequences of variability in odorant receptor genes. He is the author of The Philosophy of Olfactory Perception, in which he explores the philosophically interesting difference between seeing and smelling, and the owner of Olfactory Art Keller, an art gallery in New York's Chinatown that is dedicated to the exploration of scent as a creative medium. John McGann is the director of the Rutgers University Center for Cognitive Science and a tenured professor of behavioral and systems neuroscience in the psychology department at Rutgers. He runs the McGann Laboratory on the neurobiology of sensory cognition, which uses the olfactory system of humans and rodent models to explore how organisms learn about and interpret their sensory world. His peer-reviewed scientific work has been published in prominent journals, including Science, Neuron, and the Journal of Neuroscience. His 2017 paper in the journal Science, arguing that the human sense of smell is excellent and impactful, was downloaded 5,000 times in the first month and featured in Discover magazine's top 100 discoveries. Dmitry Rinberg is a professor of neuroscience and physiology at the NYU Grossman School of Medicine and joined the field of neuroscience after having completed his PhD in physics at the Weizmann Institute of Science. His research comprises three core domains: deciphering the fundamental principles of neural coding, exploring olfactory information processing in the brain, and harnessing the olfactory system's remarkable sensitivity as a chemical director. The Rinberg Lab pioneered new theoretical frameworks for understanding the sense of smell, alongside the development of cutting-edge technologies for communicating with the brain. By combining fundamental and applied research, the Rinberg Lab pushes the limit of our understanding of the signal processing in the olfactory system, while also developing novel applications such as odor-based disease diagnostics. The list of these panelists' accomplishments goes on from there, so I truncated a bit, but as you can see, we've accumulated quite a core of experts on the topic for today. Can you hear me? Is it on now? Yeah. So we put together this 5-part series on the senses, and of course, right off the bat, I have to decide, or I had to think about, what's the order we should do the senses in, right? So we did something I think that's sort of intuitive, where we started with touch. Taste and smell was sort of like a toss-up, and then hearing and sight. And we can all go into why that was what I thought of as sort of a natural. I don't really intend to defend it strongly, but anyway, there's something natural about it. But I have to say something interesting about contrasting taste and smell, which I just acknowledge we're like in a fight for second place or third place. People go, oh, taste, yeah, that sounds good. I want to go hear about taste. And smell, there's something a little on the aesthetic, something lowly about smell, I think. So I'll throw out that sort of aesthetic comment and see what you all think.
Without olfaction, there is no taste. Or, in other words, the contribution of the olfactory system to taste is the contribution you don't have if you have a bad cold. So most of the nuance, I was riding here on an airplane with a guy who's a big real estate lawyer in New York, who got me front row tickets to the Rangers game 2 days ago. Anyway, and he said, I don't have a sense of smell. And I said, do you like asparagus? He said, I love asparagus. I said, okay, then you have a sense of smell.
I mean, I think this is going back to the plane theme. It is a common reaction when you sit beside somebody on the plane and they get chatting to you, that they ask you, what do you do? I'm a philosopher. That can go one of two ways. Well, one of many ways. It's either going to go, what exactly is philosophy of perception, or, okay, what do you study? And I say olfaction. You get you get a kind of, oh, okay, right. And there's this kind of assumption, this kind of reaction where it's dealing with icky things, gross things, as opposed to beautiful things like perfume. That is not the first reaction that so the aisle mate reaction is seconded in that.
Yeah, people think of smells just as a one dimension from pleasant to unpleasant. If you give people smells and tell them to arrange them, they're going to do it from the worst to the best. Nobody would do that for colors, like this is my favorite color, this is my least favorite color. They would arrange it by the quality of the color. And taste is quality too, sour, bitter. So the qualities are really what's important there. And for smell, for many people, it's just a one-dimensional, pleasant, unpleasant thing. So when people come in my gallery and smell something, it's like, oh, I like it. Oh, I don't like this. They wouldn't go in a, fine art gallery and look at paintings and be like, this is ugly and this is pretty, right? They would talk about it in a completely different way. So for smell, this dimension, it's there. Some people can talk differently about it, but it's usually ignored.
There is something quite artificial about dividing the series into 5 separate modalities. I think it's become increasingly clear, both from a neuroscientific basis and perhaps even from a philosophical perspective, that a lot of these things we have traditionally parsed into separate modalities actually really profoundly interact, both in the biological sense that you've got, you think about the taste of a buffalo wing, you've got, 5 or 6 senses involved in that, right? Because you've got both the sort of true sweet, sour, salty, bitter taste, you've got the retronasal smell, you've got the orthonasal smell as it comes to your mouth, but you've also got this trigeminal mediated chemesthetic sense of heat and spiciness, you've got the physical warmth or cold if it's been sitting a little too long, and even some of the bone conduction of the sound of the crunch as you go through it if it's breaded or things like that. I mean, it's true both in our experience that our experience is intensively cross-modal, but also at the level of neural processing. It seems like this information is coming together early to make sort of richly multimodal representations, and then also feeding back such that each sensory system potentially knows a lot about what the other sensory systems have or might experience. So.
Well, I'm the least qualified to speak on these matters as an historian, because historians don't see taste as stable or as a purely aesthetic question. The historian would trace the context in which a smell had a certain meaning and how that is learned over time. And your airplane example is very interesting, not least because I think there's a tendency towards habituation, right, in which smells that are new then become accepted and not worthy upon comment. The historian, the challenge is finding the silence in the record, because that tells you when the smell is now normalized. So depending on when you are on that aircraft, how old you are, who you are, when you're flying, there will be a comment on the smell or not. So the challenge for the historian is to look at change over time, and it's not a stable sense at all. So when you talk about the aesthetics of smell, I wrote a chapter on the smell of Gettysburg, right? The smell of the Battle of Gettysburg is an entirely different experience than seeing Gettysburg, right? And there are 6,000 dead soldiers, 2,000 dead horses and mules in the July sun in Pennsylvania. Gettysburg expands its geographic space, not because it's seen, but because it's smelled. The smell of death is caught and spread out. It lasts until the Gettysburg Address. You can still smell Gettysburg long after it happened.
Yeah, I heard they photoshopped out the Lincoln's.
I'm not sure what that actually does, to be honest with you. But one of my concerns is, how do we treat the historical reproduction of smells by people who experience them at the time? Because this is big business, right? So what do Civil War reenactors do with the smell of Gettysburg? What do you do with that? Well, they don't wash, right? They reenact it every year and they don't wash. They want to have an authentic claim about re-experiencing the smell of Gettysburg. But I have grave reservations about the implications of that. Can we consume the past through smell? Even if we could reproduce it, are we reproducing the experience of people in 1863 today? Noses change, aircraft change, airlines change. All of these things have to be contingent on when and who is doing the smelling.
It's super interesting what you're saying. I'm a little bit coming back to the question about taste and smell. Probably the most profound difference is one is in remote sense. In order to kind of taste and smell something, you need to bring to your mouth. Smell is actually one of the remote senses, like vision and audition. You sense, and you actually experience something outside of your body. And through biology, through evolution of the senses, it was one of the very important for that reason. And that's actually kind of make it different from taste. And what has been said about the role of olfaction for taste, for food perception, of course, absolutely. But smell is has a very special, different from taste for that reason. And honestly speaking, I never experienced this effect. When somebody asking me what you study says, wow, mostly the effect was like that rather than a kind of smirking.
Maybe it's the philosophy plus the,
Yeah, I think that
they
might
just
be
think
it.
something
Yeah.
suspicious is going on. Yeah.
It's much more interesting than I'm an historian. Really?
Eye mask goes on.
The mask goes on.
You're a historian in the South who has a funny Southern accent.
Well, yeah, that's always the comment. It's not about what I do. It's like, why are you there in the South? What are you doing?
So a couple of things. And this is, first, the reason I'm in New York at the moment is because 25 years ago we speculated that the olfactory system actually works by detecting the presence of metabolic pathways. And that those metabolic, and that has something you've learned over evolutionary time. So there is a stability, we would suggest, fundamentally in olfactory perception that has to do with the fact that we think, and we have reason to believe this is true, that it's dependent on detecting metabolic pathways. Okay, not aldehydes, alcohols, and the sorts of things that chemists like to throw at the olfactory system. So that's one thing. But the second thing, the multisensory thing, that's interesting about the olfactory system, and it's not only mammalian, it's all olfactory systems, as you know, is that the olfactory system is sort of special in brains in a way, because you go directly from the primary, in mammals, for example, the primary olfactory cortex. The next structure, which is called the entorhinal cortex, is the most multimodal cortex in the brain. In insects, it's the mushroom bodies. So the olfactory system in particular, and then by the way, from entorhinal cortex, you go to hippocampus. So most people in this room know that one of the things about olfaction is that it evokes very strong memories, and people believe the hippocampus is involved in that. So the point is that uniquely for the olfactory system, in some ways, it is clear that you need multimodal information to be able to distinguish, which, by the way, is also why the olfactory system is so heavily context dependent. Because, as we probably, as a physicist, figuring out what something is by the molecules you get, meaning coffee, it's 450 different chemicals. Figuring that out is tricky, difficult computationally, right? And you need additional information. So the olfactory system in particular depends on context from other sensory systems. And then, but once you have it, which is, as you were talking about, it's sort of a gestalt type perception, all right? Then you go straight to the hippocampus. And the last thing to say about that is, as you know, I'm sure everyone here does know, that the perfume industry is based on noses. These are people that are highly trained to break down the smell to something other than its hedonic value, which is what he was talking about. So to get humans to actually decipher the components of a smell, rather than just saying I like it or I don't like it, or it reminds me of grandma, okay, you have to train them to be able to actually figure out. And once you do, you get paid $200,000 a year to sit in laboratories and identify what odors are. So I recommend anyone that wants a career path, if that's an interesting one.
Yeah, but the context, it not necessarily only helps to figure it out, it can also be conflicting the different senses. And then smell always loses. Right, so if you have an apple that smells like a banana, you show somebody an apple and it smells like a banana and ask them, what is this? They're going to say an apple. They're going to ignore that they smell a banana. If you show them a banana that smells like an apple, they're going to be like, this is a banana. So we trust intrinsically our visual information more than our olfactory information. And so the olfactory, the visual information and all the other context information can push around our identification of a smell into very, very different territories. There's interesting studies where the exact same molecule is presented to people in different contexts, and it's a molecule that's found in stinky cheese and also in, dirty, sweaty socks. It's the same molecule, isovaleric acid. And if you present it to people, making them believe that it's sweat, they talk about it very, very differently than when they get the same thing and you tell them this is a fancy cheese. And so that, like the philosophical question that you can answer for us then is, does it smell different or does it smell the same? But people put all this other stuff together and come to a different conclusion, also it smells the same to that. Or is that interaction at a perceptual level where it actually modulates the smell of the molecule into something else?
Okay.
I didn't mean to put you on the spot like that.
Question. Very
Reminds
easy
me of what you were
question.
saying before about how it can change also over time, how it's
Yeah.
experienced.
Yeah, right. So I would pick up on if you tell them something.
Yeah.
And I would go back one step. Depends on who's saying what and from what position of authority they're saying it. So, if you look at the history of race in this country, modern segregation began with the 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson case, right? In which a visually ambiguous black man, Homer Plessy, sat on a railroad car in New Orleans in order to test whether or not segregation would work. So he sat in the white car. He had to tell the conductor that he was technically African American under Louisiana law. He was visually ambiguous, but Louisiana law was, it's this proportion, and they tested it, they took it to court. You couldn't tell his race visually. So the authentication of visual evidence was highly dubious, and they were trying to expose that. That case went to court, and the prosecutor responded to the question from the judge. The judge said, how can you tell his race if you can't see him? Because if you can't see him, you can't possibly have a system of segregation. And the prosecutor replied, I don't need to see him, I can smell his race. There is no evidence, of course, that race is smellable. It's a social construction. But the point is, it was the state saying they could. And if you're in the position of authority to authenticate that a group of people smell, it doesn't matter if you can empirically identify it. What matters is the authority of the state to underwrite it. And that matters a great deal. So it's really who's telling you that it smells like a banana? Is it the authority of science behind it? Is it the authority of a state? And it can have enormous implications. Because if you look at the beginning of segregation, you can't explain segregation without reference to the deployment of the stereotype of smell. It was not simply a stable visual category. It had to be invoked as an olfactory one.
Yeah, that's definitely true. When I'm at wine tastings, you drink the wine, and then the person tells you, oh, that tastes a little bit like banana. And then you're like, oh, yeah, now I can taste it, right? So you go along, and the more charismatic and, certain they are, the more you go along with whatever they tell you. And I often wonder if you would just do such a thing and tell people random words, what it smells like, if people would just nod along. There's a lot of these, suggestibility experiments where, the teacher opens a bottle and tells people it's filled with a horrible smell, and people should raise their hand when they smell it so it can tell how it spreads. And people start raising their hands, and then the people next to it start raising their hands, and then a wave of raised hands goes through the classroom, and there's no smell in there.
But you have to be a little careful because our experiments with mice, they are much more likely to rely on the olfactory percept than the visual. Of course, mice aren't very visual, and although the psychophysicists or the neurobiologists keep trying to make them into vision animals by wiping down every cage with alcohol before they actually do the experiment, which I pointed out recently to someone from the Allen Institute means you're basically dealing with a PTSD mouse who's in an environment that they don't know how to decipher because there are no olfactory stimuli, and you're flashing visual stimuli at them, so you're studying the brain in a very bad state. But anyway, so humans, and also obviously human society, right? Giving you a predisposition to go one way or the other. And tons of marketing is based on this, as we know, especially. But one other thing to say, we haven't talked about the contrast between vision and olfaction. Probably 100 times more people study vision than study olfaction, maybe 1,000 more, okay, which is odd for a bunch of reasons. But anyway, one difference between vision and olfaction is that in olfaction, the thing is actually in your nose. So it's not an inferential sense. And the nervous system knows that. That's why scratch and sniff movies don't work. Because if you're sitting there in a movie, and they tried scratch and sniff movies, okay, as soon as they put an odor, everyone comes out of the movie and assumes that the guy 2 rows back is doing something they shouldn't be doing. Okay, so you come out of the presence of the movie and immediately start to interpret and think about what might be going on in the room you're actually in. Because if the olfactory, probably, yes, the olfactory system gets a signal, it knows it's real. It may not know what it is, but it knows it's real. And so it's hard to, so they don't, scratch and sniff movies don't work. But conversely, it's illegal to use subliminal advertising in vision, okay, which they also tried in the 50s, and it's illegal because it doesn't work. The perfume industry and the olfactory system, which does work, is not only legal, it's a multi-billion-dollar industry.
So, coming back to vision and olfaction, I actually believe that part of the mystery of olfaction is our lack of knowledge. And if you think about it, for example, context dependence, if we don't know the trichromatic vision that we have red, green, and blue, looking at all kind of the illusion when you see different colors will be completely mysterious, because the color perception depends on the context. Yeah. And the recently, blue or gold dress was a very famous illusion that kicked the internet, and it's actually similar. Basically, we now know the basis of the color vision. It has been more or less discovered at the beginning of the 20th century, the color vision, and we understand the trichromatic vision, and now we can understand the context dependence. I strongly believe the same thing happening with olfaction. There is a basics which we still don't grasp, and on top of that, there's a context and all this stuff. This is on top of that. And until we understand this, we can speculate on the role of the all these factors, but fundamentals is not yet established. So, and I can speculate why it is. It's much more kind of complex system, compared to color, just because of the variety of the degrees of freedom, and much less effort was invested in this field. As Jim pointed out, that only, maybe 100 to 1,000 less people working on olfaction, but I don't see big difference.
Well, is the context dependence with olfaction more related to the, say, emotional milieu, as opposed to vision, where, for example, when they work out these complexities of the visual system, it doesn't seem that applies as much?
That's how I was going to initially answer, in part, or start to answer your question, was to say that there's context dependence in vision, and insofar as we're thinking about ways that things might work differently or the same as philosophers, and thinking about whether or not sort of what color a color chip against a different background actually has, and whether we go sort of relational on it, as we will say. Very same questions come up in the case of olfaction for philosophers. And so I don't think there's many people sort of that have been doing that so far in the philosophical literature. But one interesting question is to think about the context dependence in olfaction, which we might not have just enough information yet to really answer the question, whether or not it's a kind of hedonic thing or whether or not it's a quality thing, the way the color cases present us, or whether it's I don't know, in the cases of the cheese, a matter of belief or some sort of cognitive state. So these are super interesting questions that philosophers are very, or ought to be, or are very interested in.
Yeah, one also has to, consider the possibility. We talk about, how unreliable and context-dependent smell is, but maybe that's because we use the same things we use for vision, same tests for olfaction, right? So if you use the same tests for a system that evolved to do something else, it's the giving the wrong test to assess how good it is. If olfaction's main function is to guide behaviors or modulate emotions, mood, states or something, and not to have naming, which, is a plausible assumption, then, those tests, banana or apple, is an unfair comparison because that's not what smell does. And I think we're pretty reliable in, eating something or not eating something depending on the smell, right? There's not a lot of variability and context, right? It's like you can vary the visual appearance. If it smells rotten, it's going to be very difficult for somebody to eat that because that behavior is evolutionary, what's being, guided by smell. And the naming smells probably hasn't been all that important throughout that development, and it's just like a more current thing that we're doing.
So can I pick up on your emotion question, because I think it's very important. So emotion too is historically situated, right? So in a pro-miasmic or pre-germ theory age, smell is rife and laden with the emotion of fear, much more than it is with just disgust, another emotion. Disgust might be a more common emotion outside of a context in which the smell of something could mean death, right? So miasma in the 19th century, people thought that the smell was the cause of disease. It may or may not have been, but fear is deeply embedded on what people smell. The same is true of what emotional vocabulary was available to people. So the emotion of indignation in the 19th century was far more present than it is now. Indignation doesn't occupy an important emotional space for us. Lead up to the Civil War, indignation meant a great deal. Jealousy meant something different. In other words, it's not just the sensory component that has a historical context, it's the emotional register that's attached to it. So fear is very important when it comes to smell, depending on when you're looking.
Yeah, 100 years ago, Manhattan smelled like horse manure. Now it smells like cannabis. And I would
It bloody well does, doesn't it? Yeah, I noticed that.
I raise horses, so I would prefer horses, frankly, to the cannabis.
Yeah, you're right, but can we go back to this scratch and sniff thing? Because I think this is fascinating, and I'm learning a great deal from this round table. But so historic homes, historic sites, they retail and smell to get people in. Why? Because seeing things is just not as interesting, right? But if you can smell something, there is a Viking village in Jorvik, a recreation in England, right? And the single most popular part of that village is the Viking latrine. And they will give you a scratch and sniff card, and you will smell it, and people will love it. They say, well, this is fascinating, because you're smelling the Viking latrine. But you're not. What you're smelling is a representation of what we think a Viking latrine smelled like. The Viking would be like, smells normal to me, just as 100 years ago, horse manure would have been habituated. I don't think I'm quite there with the habituation of the smell of cannabis in New York, but I bet you I would be if I lived here.
Could be, but by the way, the best museum in Paris is the Sewer Museum.
Because it appeals to that sense,
you
right?
actually go into the Sewer Museum and you're walking over the sewer, which is not a scratch and sniff experience.
It's the real thing. Authenticity matters, right?
And speaking of context, I don't know if you've ever been to that museum, but it's in the sewer. And the big thing they talk about, of course, is that Napoleon's engineers figured out how to make the first modern city because they figured out how to have a sewer system. And as you're walking through the museum, surrounded by the smell of French sewer, okay, it makes the experience of the museum. That's why I didn't know about your museum, but I'm fascinated. What?
They learned to do it under Napoleon III.
Well, one Napoleon, another Napoleon, I don't know. Anyway, so.
Yeah, the why scratch and sniff movies don't work also points to another difference between smelling and hearing, and that is that for hearing, we can believe that something is a representation. So I can show you an image, the most horrible image, dead people, like something that if you would see it in real, would shake you to the bone. But you know it's a movie, you know these are actors, you watch it, and you know you can be pretty detached. With smell, that doesn't work. If I make the smell of rotten corpses in the lab, and I tell you, you know, this is artificial, and I open it, you're probably going to throw up, or at least leave the room, because also some part of your brain knows that this isn't real. Smell is not influenced by that, and it's always perceived as authentic. It's very difficult to perceive a smell as a representation of the real smell. So that is why, you know, there's a big difference between doing visual entertainment and smell entertainment. In visual entertainment, you can do horrible things. In smell entertainment, if you do it, people will leave.
Isn't that a technology issue? Is it a technology issue if we can deliver smell at the level how we can deliver visual pictures or sound picture with the whole dynamics?
Yeah.
Maybe that problem will be solved, because currently you smell, the smell lingers, you cannot get rid of it, but it's all, I mean, conceptually solvable if you kind of, you know, have an image of something and a whiff of smell and it passes away. It's actually very real. And then just if you can deliver it in a proper way, which we don't know yet how to do it well. The failure of the smell movie is not because, I believe, it's basically because we can deliver proper smell.
Yeah, they had smell-orama, where they had a machine.
But that's
that
basically the
in.
problem is that you cannot wave out the previous smell.
Yeah.
But when animals are out in the world, okay, and it's intrinsically multimodal, okay, and again, computationally thinking about this from the point of view of designing sensory animals, you know, one of the things you're trying to determine is what's real and what's not. And I really, you know, olfaction is real because the thing is in your nose. Whether you can figure it out or not, whether you know what it is or not, it's a separate issue, but it's in your nose for sure. I think people, animals naturally kind of know that vision is inferential.
I don't understand what you mean by that.
What I
if
mean
I
is
see
that,
you, you're real. I see this picture
you're seeing me because of a bunch of photons that you're interpreting.
The same thing, photons or molecules. What's the difference? What's the difference?
There's an enormous difference between actually having the thing in your nose and picking it up.
A photon on your eye?
Sure, of course.
So
because, well, for example,
my eye,
let me give you
pure
a
physics.
concrete example, and by the way, we may end up with an argument about this. Let's put it this way. There are many, many optical illusions, okay, where you fool the visual system to think one thing or another. In fact, they're also heavily used in marketing and everything else. There are very few, and some would say no, olfactory illusions.
That has a very clear explanation. Because of in some sense, the multidimensional, the large parameter space of the olfactory world, so it's very difficult to fool you there. And in vision, you can, let's say, substitute colors with different stuff, or if you're talking about 3D vision, not color vision, there's a lot of things to play to create illusion.
Yeah, there are like 47 different visual areas.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, which, by the way, let me toss one other thing out, and I'll put it on the table. So one of the things we proposed many years ago, which is the basis for a lot of the research we've done, is that the olfactory system is actually where the cerebral cortical algorithm was initially evolved. And that the entire rest of it, and neocortex in particular, is about figuring out how to take sensory information from fundamentally non-olfactory-like sense. Vision is very two-dimensional. I'll give you 3 dimensions, some velocity you throw in, whatever, and actually allowing those sensory systems to use what is fundamentally an olfactory calculation. And if you can, this is a computational argument, but it turns out you can look at the genetics and the development, say the same thing. So I don't want to toss that out, given the nature of the conversation. And I think that's also one of the reasons that visual illusion works, in some sense, and olfaction doesn't, because it's 3 steps from the olfactory receptors to the hippocampus, 3 or 4 steps. It's 48 steps from the retina, okay? But that reflects sort of the evolutionary history of cortex. And so my view is that mammals in particular are deeply olfactory, that we sense the world in an olfactory mode, but that sometimes we do it with vision, sometimes we do it with audition, sometimes we like music, all that stuff, but that this is a kind of computation that would not have come around if it had not been the task the olfactory system has to solve. So as I said, I think one of the reasons that illusions work in the visual system is it's a complex processing process to get from something on the retina to identifying an object somewhere in IT through 45 different steps, okay? It's exactly 3 steps, and if olfactory receptors are metabolic pathway detectors, it turns out to be 1 step to understand what an olfactory object is. So
I completely agree with that statement.
don't do that.
No, but I will say, sorry, we can argue about other stuff, but in this respect, I fully agree with you. And I add even more that probably, I look at the olfaction as a biological sense, just what biology tells us about. And humans know some kind of interesting model for studying olfaction, not the best one, but one of the models. But through evolution, probably one of the ancient sense, bacteria has olfaction. Bacteria navigate towards smell, and through evolution from the very simple organism to mammals, actually it's amazing how kind of life matter interacts with the external world using chemical senses. And that's actually absolutely, sorry for being to agree with you, but but yes, it
But
was.
your student 2 days ago said you need to go down the hall at NYU because I spent 3 hours proselytizing a student, and so go down and fight with him about it, but it wasn't a fight. Oh my goodness.
I mean, I was going to say something when you were talking about the difference between, or what I took to you to be saying, the difference between watching a movie and actually presenting somebody with, a chemical or an odor, that, and you sort of echoed it when you were saying, look, the molecules are in your nose. And so it struck me when you were saying that the difference is that when you're watching the movie, it's a representation, of a visual scene before the eyes, but you give somebody a smell and it's there. There's no representation. It is absolutely there, and it's in your nose. So that struck me as, and then you echoed it in what you just said.
And by the way, the reason movies work is because the olfactory system, by inventing this algorithm, and I don't want to get too far into this, but computing devices, a key feature of computing devices are the clocks. You cannot build a computing device without a clock. And so we guessed a while ago, like 40 years ago, that the clocking, that the oscillations, let's call them, in cortex, came from olfaction. And that was what was responsible. So, for example, flicker fusion is twice the processing speed of the olfactory system. But we predicted...
So you might have an
Flicker fusion being how movies work.
That's right.
How we see discrete images quickly, and they
I
fuse together.
suspect, and I don't know this, but it would be nice to know, birds, who, by the way, they're vulsed, probably came out of the geniculate, not the olfactory system. I suspect they're very confused by movies. Okay? But we predicted...
Better get a grant for that.
Yes. Believe me, I couldn't. But we predicted, therefore, and did an actual experiment, that slow wave sleep, which is a very important part of sleep, it's where memory consolidation is believed to go on, that slow wave sleep, which is at 0.5 hertz to 1.5 hertz, might actually be synced by breathing. And it turns out that that's true, and it turns out now that there are a bunch of new studies showing that even higher level cognition is influenced by the breathing phase. So this idea that, 1,000 more people work on vision because they think we're visual animals, okay? Although I ask my students often, they say, well, olfaction doesn't really matter much to me. And I say, how many times did you go out on a date twice with someone you didn't like how they smell? And the answer is 0. Doesn't happen. What they look like, their manners are bad, no problem. But smell, very, very fundamental.
That reminds me of something that happened to me recently. I was at a concert, and of course now everybody's watching concerts through their phones, and but people were very good about it and put them away, and I was trying to be very, very good in not having my watch sort of go off, and there's this guy sitting next to me, and he very much smelled like he had had a lot of onions for dinner right before coming. And, we were sort of like 30, 40 minutes into the concert, and sort of my clapping was setting off my watch. And he turned to me and said, "Can you please turn your watch off?" And I thought, okay, so that's kind of acceptable here. But if I would have said, "Can you smell better, please?" that wouldn't have been acceptable. And it struck me, I was kind of annoyed, and I thought, well, I'll get my own back when I go to the round table, in a couple of weeks in New York. So there we go. But it did strike me in the moment, the philosopher, and thinking about the differences between, the various senses, but also similarities, but the differences, but also in our attitudes towards them. We very much, in that moment, I thought, yeah, this is an indication of you take yourself to be a visual creature, because that's the things that's bugging you. And the smell was kind of bugging me, but
and people don't realize hugging is an olfactory behavior. Mm-hmm. They don't realize that.
So there is a compelling connection between a modest number of molecules get into your nose, and it evokes potentially a very complex string of behaviors, right? So if the example I'll use is you're in a shopping mall, and you smell Cinnabon, and you probably weren't expecting to go buy a very sugary treat, but somehow a few molecules hitting your nose is able to evoke this very complex set of behaviors. It involves pathfinding and navigation. It requires you to overcome all of your youthful training and talk to a stranger, right? And then eat something given to you by a stranger. And it's a few molecules that hit your nose that somehow compel 100 billion neurons to do something in concert towards a goal. In my lab, we do a lot of work on how early olfactory circuits change. And we're increasingly thinking it's not about how to change the perceptions so much as it's about to change a way to change the coupling between the sensory system and downstream neural circuits, which in turn leads to potentially complex problem solving and behavior. But in all of those cases, you bring your own personal context with you, right? I have plenty of colleagues from outside the United States who smell Cinnabon, and their opposite is the exact opposite, right? That smells terrible. I was once on a panel with the founder of Starbucks. Yeah. And I looked at him and I said, "Why are you manipulating us with smells of coffee?" Right. And he looked at me and said, "That's why we succeeded."
Well, this goes back to my question earlier, I think, about is the connection between what we smell and how we experience smells, let's say disposition to act, is that translatable into it being closer to our emotional experience than other senses? In some senses? So some of the demonstrations that we've talked about are actual demonstrations I do in some of my courses. So the example of the odor that smells like vomit or it smells like cheese, depending on what you've been told, really works. But I've done it anecdotally on hundreds, if not thousands, of undergraduates at this point. And in that case, there's a very clear emotional component. You'll have someone who'll basically stick their nose in it and go, "Oh, that's a pretty good artificial Parmesan cheese scent." And then the same person will retch
and leave. But it also works with non-emotional stimuli, but not to the same degree. So I'll do the same thing with a component of a banana odor, and you have to kind of hype it up and get into the sort of showmanship of it. But you could absolutely persuade a group of undergraduates that this is an artificial strawberry. Give them a very distinctive banana, and oh yeah, no, that's strawberry. But they say, nope, but it's actually banana. And almost everybody will switch back immediately and won't be able to go back to strawberry once they've gotten that recognition. But I will occasionally get somebody, in fact, one of the angriest I've ever made a student was I got someone who, I saw it in his eyes and I said, it's strawberry, it's banana, it's strawberry, it's banana. He got up and he yelled at me, right? So there is some individual variability in the ability to
Just
adapt
a
here.
caveat, we know this from studies. So ephemeral glucoside, which it turns out probably to be activated about 50% of, that's why we're visiting Firmenich, so they can, that's what I was doing, so they can do the experiment. So ephemeral glucoside, there are 3 molecules that across many fruits signify ripeness. Okay, so this is a case where the fruit have cooperated, if you want to think of it that way, to trigger, and mammalian olfactory receptors may be particularly sensitive to those 3. So we might think a banana and a fruit and an apple is different, but the banana and the apple have agreed to share agreed, okay, to share, it was all designed, okay, so it was designed. Agreed, well, they've shared a trigger that's set to the mammal that says, now is the time to eat me. So it's a little tricky if you're doing those sorts of experiments because the fruit themselves have molecules that they commonly have to manipulate us. So it turns out a banana and an apple is not as chemically far away as you might necessarily think because one is yellow and one is red.
Yeah, it's also, hard to imagine that we would ever need to distinguish between banana and strawberry in, prehistoric times. We're looking for fruit. We are hungry, want some fruit. We're not going to be disappointed if we find a banana instead of a strawberry. We want to make sure if it's good to eat.
Well, once slapstick was invented.
Exactly.
So I found what you said fascinating because it just, again, reminds me of the politics of smell, right? You're telling a student it's banana and strawberries. Well, you're the professor. You have the authority to make that claim. It's a bit like when George Orwell supposedly said, and it might be apocryphal, but I could imagine him saying it, there are 2 words that describe the English working class. They smell. That is a claim about a class from an elite English leader, a thought leader. They could never escape the claim. Not because of what they did. If working class women put on perfume, it was cheap perfume, right? If working class men tried to make themselves smell better, it never really worked. The politics of the claim matters a great deal. And I'm in no position to contradict the science here. It sounds very persuasive. But the moment at which you say it and who says it has to matter, right? There's this scheme called culture in history that filters what people are smelling and how they're smelling it and what values. And this is very dangerous stuff. This is not just some frivolous observation. I mean, we have whole regimes historically that have deployed smell and the claim that certain groups of people smell and need to be marginalized to great effect. This is not something that is without political implication.
By the way, you know that there's a genetic link between the histocompatibility complex and pheromones. The histocompatibility complex is how your cells recognize that they're your cells, and the immune system therefore mostly doesn't attack them. So we now know that that pheromones, in fact the ones that you get from the back of your ear, have a genetic relationship, a DNA relationship to the histocompatibility complex. So, as I said before, hugging is actually an olfactory task, or an olfactory behavior. Next time you hug someone, try to exhale. Okay, so you get them close, get your nose close to the back of their ear, and you inhale, right? And when I do that, I say it's so nice to smell you, and then they jump back. But the point is this, it is very we know this is true in mice, we know it's true in many mammals. People argue whether humans have as much of a pheromonic, blah, 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 but my former student, Noam Sobel, has shown pretty clearly that that's nonsense. Humans do have this strong pheromonic thing. It could be that the signal you're giving, the olfactory signal you're getting, is actually telling the receiver something about your genetics. So when you talk about the historical use of olfaction for racism, okay, it's very likely related to the same kind of concerns about interbreeding, the same kinds of concerns about purity of the race, because there is probably a relationship between the odors you give off and your genetics, right?
I think this goes back to my initial question. I don't think I got a satisfactory answer, which is, why does it seem there's a slight bias towards a negative feeling about smell? Like, let's grant for a minute that there is perhaps some difference among different biological groups, call them, in terms of their smell. The question isn't, can people be distinguished because they smell differently, but how is it so easy to append a negative connotation to it?
Why do we cut the hair we cut? Why do women cut the hair they cut? Now even more of it than they used to. That's how smells are distributed. Why do we wear perfumes? Because we don't want to be judged.
Why do you think I understand there are wonderful smells and there's an industry based upon perfumes and all that, but I still say that a lot of our conversation, not all of it, we've talked about both positive and negative, but I'm guessing that there's a little bit of a negative valence on the general category of smell. Maybe it has to do with the historical use of it.
You want to be judged based on your odor.
Well, but why you judge negatively?
Mostly you're selecting negatively.
Look, and partly because it's very difficult to argue against, right? So the claim, and you think about the language, think about the vocabulary that is available to us to discuss the topic of smell. It's a very impoverished vocabulary. You smell. What does that mean? Are you smelling? Do you smell? Is it a good thing? No. Embedded in the language itself, which is historically associated and conditioned, is a claim. Now, you disprove to me that you don't smell and you're in a weaker position than I am. Good luck with that. The apparatus of the culture and the politics underwriting that culture, if I own that apparatus and I identify you as you smell, is really hard to push back. That's why it's so powerful. The language is impoverished, it's difficult to be subtle, and historically, you're right, it is negative, not always, but that's precisely why it's used. It's such a statement of authority.
Also, isn't it because of distance? You cannot say somebody doesn't taste good, because you have to taste them. But you can say somebody doesn't.
It's a later stage of the process.
But you can say that they have no taste as an aesthetic claim, as a social claim, which is intimately related to what they're eating. So that's why enslaved people were fed wretched food, because they didn't have the aesthetic ability or the gustatory ability to distinguish good food from bad food. And it also happened to be a lot cheaper.
By the way, my former student, Alfredo Fontanini, who you know, has been studying this question, and one of the things that he has found is that in order to taste, which also involves olfaction, food later, to have a more sophisticated ability to distinguish between foods, which involves also taste and smell, you have to be exposed to it early. So if you're not exposed to a diverse range of foods early, then you do not simply have the ability to perceive. So the reason that a kid that at age 15 doesn't like broccoli is because they didn't actually get exposed to broccoli when they were young. They got exposed to something that Gerber made. I mean, you know more about that than I do, I'm sure.
There's also, there's also in our society this tendency to deodorize. So it's not just between like a smell being a good smell or a bad smell, but the ideal being no smell at all. Like being completely smellless is an ideal. And, you know, people complain about people wearing perfumes, even though they're beautiful, wonderful perfumes all the time, right? So it's not just within smells which ones are good or bad, but it's any smell is bad because it's kind of uncontrollable and like invades your private space. You wouldn't say people don't want to stuff stuff up your nose, which is what they're doing when they make you smell them, right? So it's like just like this ideal of having no odor at all makes a lot of the discourse about odor negative to begin with. I mean, the words odor and smell, if you don't deliver any other context, people assume that's something bad. There's an odor here, it smells here. The assumption would be it's bad.
I mean, there's the deodorizing, but then the perfume industry has a very, very firm grip. We also like, you know, so it's almost like that. They sort of, perfumes come in. Yes, a lot of people complain. Well, I mean, I actually, there's two people in my department who wear any sort of perfume or cologne. It's me and somebody else. There's never been a complaint, but I do worry about it because there is this kind of, this worry that you'll be bothering somebody, headaches, etc. But there is, you know, with our homes, with our spaces, this move to deodorizing and having no smell, but then it seems like the perfume industry sort of swoops into that absence to fill it up again. With our homes as well as, you know, our bodies, yeah. There's a sort of tension between, I mean, I think you're right, it's deodorize, oh, no, fill that space. Deodorize, no, fill it with something nice. And this push-pull kind of thing.
It's about having control of the smell.
Yeah.
So
And it's a rhetorical conceit, right? It's like the quest for silence. There is no such thing as silence. You will always end up hearing your own body. The idea of odorlessness is a conceit of the 19th century elites. And in the 20th century reodorizes it, but along the lines that are acceptable to those people.
Yeah.
So it's a rhetorical position rather than a reality that can be produced. Silence, taste, so all of these things are clumsily situated, and odorlessness is one of them. But it has an historical origin, right?
But isn't it a voice selection?
Comment on your about taste. That is true in English, and it's true in French. It's not true in Armenian. It's not true in Farsi, because that term cannot be applied in the same way.
Yeah, so this is a good example of context, right? You know, my language skills are very limited. I wish they were greater. I understand the English-speaking context, but that does not mean that it applies to the Armenian-speaking context. And that's where historical geography, historical sociology, the contextual apparatus really matters. And what it does is it can certainly reinforce the universal claim, but it can also destabilize it or make it more textured in a way that this particular culture doesn't have that language for this, which means their historical experience is going to be different, even though the biological conditioning might be exactly the same. I'm basically calling for history. That's it.
No, it's fascinating.
So I think it's about selection. You don't want to be selected against. That poor guy sitting next to you, okay, you had the onion French soup at the very, very good restaurant where you actually get a lot of onions, okay? He did not want to be selected against. I think you don't want to be selected against based on your odor. And in your case, for sure, the people that were slaves, you know, or people that are in the lower English class, you would rather not. So we decided to be as odorless as possible, and furthermore, I mean, I use shell in the number 5 myself, that you then furthermore decide that we're all going to smell the same, right? It's a tribal thing, right? And then, of course, the perfume industry takes advantage of that and shifts it around every couple of, just because they're making money. But it's better to all smell the same than to go out with somebody and actually have them smell what you really smell like and decide not to do it again, because that is that's a very common thing, right? So I think we all agree to not smell, and then we all agree to smell like the thing that indicates that we're hip and cool and we're not part of the lower English middle class.
Well, I'll vote that I was. So I ended up smelling American. I don't know.
No, you still smell like the lower English class.
Oh, well, thank you. You're a good man. I'm proud of you. So it's a very intimate thing, isn't it? I mean, how often you didn't say to the chap in the orchestra, you smell.
Yeah, no.
But we wouldn't also, even if we refine it, we wouldn't say, you smell nice. It's very intimate.
She wouldn't say that.
No, I mean, I wouldn't say that.
You wouldn't.
Oh, I don't think I've ever said
If you do say it, you're sticking your neck out.
Yeah, you bloody well are. Yes, you are. Yes, you are.
That's what I was going to say when you're saying you smell, that's bad. That has a negative
right.
element. But we can supplement that with you smell nice. It will take a predicate.
Right. It has a definite intimacy.
But that you are sticking your neck out, and people are shocked when you say, "Oh, you smell really nice today." It's like you've invaded their space.
Because I didn't yesterday.
Yeah.
Is that what it means? Right?
When undergraduates take my course, I tell them they're going to learn things that are really interesting and important and will change their lives. And one of them is, you go to a bar, you hug as many people as possible, you're consciously aware of which ones smell best, and then when you hit someone that smells good, there's a good chance you smell good to them too, so you actually then spend more time on that person. And then eventually you say, I like how you smell, and then the rest, as they say, is history.
I obviously, A, need to take your class. B, need to go to the bars that you go to, and C, learn my vocabulary a bit better, yes.
There's a company in New York that make a dating by sending each other smells. So you wear the T-shirt for 5 days, then you cut this T-shirt and send different. And if there is a match between two of us, they organize their date. It's kind of all blind. You smell a bunch of piece of shirt that you previously wear, the other person previously wear. And great idea. I don't know how successful they are.
Yeah, that would be very interesting.
It's easier than hugging everyone in the bar.
Exactly.
Might put off a few people.
The scalability of smell here, I'm loving it.
The bars in Ashland are small.
I think we're going to open up for questions shortly, but I wanted to hear a little bit more about this idea about the olfactory system possibly being a sort of a template for the other senses, and I wonder if you could all take that up and maybe talk about that.
So here's the argument. It's I don't know, someone else wants to defend
Well,
this
so
idea.
I'll start at the very fundamental, right? So ultimately what we're doing in the olfactory system is detecting chemicals. And that's one of the most absolutely fundamental things in any biological system, which is ultimately chemistry and physics. And there's been increased understanding over the last few decades that the biological apparatus that evolved to detect chemicals in the world is also used internally in the body to detect chemicals in places like the carotid body and other places where it's sort of a basic chemical detector. And so that kind of begins the process of it's a fundamental sense, but it extrapolates out in many other ways, and could the same computational principles that a system like that might have to use to be specific to the particular chemical in question, to have some sense of intensity or concentration that could be used to feed into a decision-making process. How do I change my cell this way in response to that chemical that I detected? That actually turns out to be a broader set of computational principles from which you can build other sensory systems and ultimately minds and behaviors.
There's a very specific hypothesis, which is that in reptiles, for example, like I said, there's this you need this multimodal input. So the visual system, the auditory system, the somatosensory system, visceral pain, all of them are connected into this very highly multimodal structure that's right next to the olfactory system and that interacts with the olfactory system. So then what happens? Well, if you can build more steps to make the signal that comes from the retina more amenable to an olfactory-like calculation by building subsequent processing stages between the retina, or between visual cortex and IT. Then you sort of build out the system that allows the visual system to use a fundamentally olfactory calculation in a much more sophisticated way. The implication of that, most people think that the neocortex sort of somehow came out of vision, okay? And they're very confused about the fact that V1 has a very different structure across mammals, all right? But if you believe, as we have proposed, that actually this is this process of building stages in between, it means that V1 should have very different structures across very different mammals. But the core idea is that only the olfactory system, because it had this demand requirement, computational requirement to do this kind of gestalt multisensory calculation, was in a position to actually evolve that type of computation, and that the other systems took advantage of it. And that is what neocortex is taking advantage of basically olfactory processing. So, people often, Gordon Shepherd and others said many times that the olfactory system is like the visual system. In fact, the visual system is more like the olfactory system.
Again, kind of agree with you, but wanted to add something. I'll say something from perspective of what I'm studying. I'm studying everything after what's happening after the receptors, so how we process the smell. And if you think about it, if you present a subject and smell of apple and then smell of orange, you kind of know that very different smells. But then you present a smell of lemon, you immediately say lemon probably closer to the orange. So somebody in the brain tells you the proximity, the relationship, and this computation happening probably in the cortex. I'm still trying to understand where that's happening. And it's very fundamental computation, because if you think about it, if you show you one face, another face, and the third face, you can say, oh, this face is more similar to that on that. They're probably siblings, or no, they're from different race, completely different. So you build the space of the faces, and it's actually a very similar computation that's happening in olfaction. You build a space of odors. I mean, consciously, subconsciously, I don't touch this subject. But you can ask this question, something what is computed behind the nose is very simple and basic computation that olfaction may lead us to understand.
Okay, well, I think that was wonderful, and I wonder if there are folks who want to come up and ask questions at the microphone, please.
It seems to me that there's something very important to me about the senses that really haven't been addressed. And it seems to me that this is among the most important, the one that needs it the most, which is this notion of intimacy. In other words, it is something that you experience at close range, and that is the time when it is the most powerful in terms of directing your behavior. Not only the way you think, but how you behave. So I'm talking about intimacy, right? Not just, a physical distance.
The olfactory system is the anti-free will sense. That's why we don't like it. It's the anti-free will sense, the olfactory system. That's why we don't like it. We don't like to talk about it, why we don't like to study it. So you're right, the intimacy and the fact that you actually kind of don't know what's exactly going on in that, your intimate response is really, really fundamental in the olfactory system and the way it dictates behavior.
See, I was thinking about it, right, as very similar to, the physically touching as well. And I see that as, right, very much on the same or very close plane.
Please.
Thank you for a fascinating panel. I've been coming to this room for 55 years, and this has been one of the most interesting hours. I'm primarily interested in human pathology, and right now in human degenerative disease. And I'm interested in degenerative disease as it affects the olfactory system. And one of the most striking human diseases is aging. So, and the other thing that has struck me is the increasing amount of genetic information that's now becoming available about human beings. In the UK, they're going for 1 million. It's difficult to collect genetic material and correlate it with phenotype in humans. In the United States, it's now about 250,000. I'm convinced that a lot of the things that we talk about in human disease and human function varies tremendously by genotype. And the rare diseases that we're stumbling into really require computer communication and huge genotype pools. It's striking that we test hearing and vision very early. Do we test olfaction at all in human beings?
It's likely to be the first indication of, we actually published this a long time ago, it's liable to be a first indication of Alzheimer's actually, is the inability to distinguish between odors, especially ones that are structurally quite similar. And one other little story, I was once on a panel with Spock, with Leonard Nimoy, and I said, by the way, you know how that thing worked that they scanned over the body? You know, that McCoy, right, I'm aging myself, but McCoy scanned, he said, how'd that work? He said, no, it was a TV show. I said, no, I can tell you how it worked. He said, no, it was a TV show. He said, it worked because it detected molecules. And eventually, and you know this, historically, physicians used to be trained to smell their patients to actually do diagnosis. And they stopped being trained that way, right? But actually, it's, you know, anyway, and Nimoy looked at me and said, God, it's just a TV show.
Yeah, with COVID, the smell testing has become a bigger topic because, especially early on, loss of smell was a big symptom of the infection, and then quite some money came into for funding to develop smell tests that would be deployed clinical. I have developed one myself and tried to push it into the clinic. And now after COVID, a lot of people who were affected say like, oh, I have my sense of smell back. I don't think it's good anymore. I think it's different. But you don't know because there was no baseline test before, because unlike with vision or with hearing, you don't do a regular testing of it. So if after after disturbance you test it, you don't really know what happened. And the downside of most of the tests available is that they are identification tests, so they are cultural biased. You have to know what cinnamon smells like to pass that test, right? And so the new wave of tests that's being developed tries to avoid that. So it's a non-verbal type of test, and it has to be very quick and cheap, of course, to be adopted. But there is I was at a meeting a few months ago where there's a push to, make it a universal smell test so that most people in their life will be tested for their sense of smell.
To speak to the aging component a little bit more, one of the sort of biological quirks of the olfactory system is that there's a real sense in which the neurons that are detecting the odors are on the outside of the body and they're exposed to the environment. And if you were to look at the biochemistry of the nose, what you might find is actually it's layered in defenses to try to have all sorts of enzymes that are present that seem to be designed to detoxify things that might come in. And in fact, some sense of our smell is actually confusing because because those enzymes break down odors as well. And so when we smell something, certain things, we're actually smelling both the original molecule and its metabolites in the nose. But perhaps because those cells are constantly exposed to a universe of potential toxicants, they die and are replaced throughout your life from a population of stem cells that exists in your nose, and it's constantly growing new neurons that wire into the circuit and connect back to the brain. And so it's absolutely true that there's a loss of smell statistically about the population level with age. I've seen, I think the worst number I've ever seen, which I can't vouch for, is something like 40-50% of the population over age 65 has got weaker than typical olfactory function. And one model is that there might actually be sort of the cumulative damage of exposure to all these things in the outside world. Perhaps that regenerative function degrades over time or conveys a certain vulnerability. And then that same process potentially could share a mechanism with loss of neural function elsewhere, though that's more speculative. Yeah.
I actually want to pick up also in something, come on up to the microphone, that Andreas was just saying about smell and having a baseline smell test, and also in terms of what implication it might have for incipient dementia. That is, one of the problems with doing a smell test and just saying, oh, you have anosmia, is that there's a lot of false negatives, false positives for that, rather, right? So there could be things other than dementia that accounts for it, but perhaps if we refined it or had baseline to compare to, a good example would be what we do with hearing tests. So if you think you're losing your hearing, I said if you think you're losing your hearing, and it's from old age, and it can be, and maybe you're not that old yet and you're concerned about it, if you go and get an audiology test, they will see, oh, if it's quote-unquote normal part of aging, the higher frequencies will be lost, the rest is okay, and they'll be able to tell you based on that profile that you don't need to worry, or at least this is normal aging, right? If it comes out with a very different pattern and profile, that's very meaningful. So one wonders whether that would be something in smell. If we could refine the sorts of sensitivities that are gained or lost over time, perhaps it would enable us to predict outcomes, right?
Yeah, so two things that are tested are sensitivity to a smell, what's the lowest concentration one can smell, and ability to tell two scents apart. And there is some data that shows that if the smell problems are related to, neurodegeneration, then the discrimination is more affected than the sensitivity. Whereas other things, for example, smoking, affects the sensitivity, but not so much the discrimination. So one can, find different tasks to make a differential diagnosis. There's also some theory that, like large molecules, the sensitivity to large molecules and small molecules act a little differently, but that's very speculative. So I don't know where that will be going.
But this goes back to the problem of not having a good metric for the olfactory system, and this thing that we're proposing is a metric, this metabolic detection, and it makes specific predictions, which we've been able to show. For example, one of the funny things about the olfactory system is if you smell one thing and smell another thing, sometimes smelling the first thing changes the perception of the second thing. Up until, there's no way to predict that. We predicted that if two molecules were on the same metabolic pathway, that they would cross-adapt. And that turned out to be exactly the case. So structure doesn't do it, percept doesn't do it. If the two molecules are on the same metabolic pathway, they cross-adapt. So knowing more about the receptors, is going to help build the tests. But without that, you're sort of just shotgunning it, which is how the olfactory system has worked for years, or studies of the olfactory system.
Thank you. Well, thank you for this very rich and informative panel. As some other people, we've been here many years, and it is rare that it is so precise and so good. Now, two things. One, I've been for many years a professor of architecture, and indeed, to reinforce your comments, in Chicago, in the famous Sculptor's Hall, done by Sullivan, there is a structure that means that your nose is about the same height as the feet of the line above you. And I was in a great concert by Jean-Pierre Rampal, and I couldn't enjoy it because the gentlemen behind me, typically Chicago working class people, they judge themselves up for the occasion, which means that they use cheap eau de cologne, and they brush their teeth with a certain strong paste. And the combination of this odor meant that I couldn't enjoy the concert. And I had to leave in the middle. But this is now not why I stood up to speak. The reason I stood up to speak is totally different and much more painful and difficult, and that is 9/11. Because those of you who have been here in New York at the time, following the events, when you cross 14th Street, you would have a terrible smell, which was a combination, of course, a dead body was certainly part of it. And it went on for a while, but after about 25 minutes, it died out. And that really brought to my mind the experience of the people around concentration camps and gas chambers. It must have been a terrible smell. How come they did not react to it? How come nobody mentioned it? I think it's the same thing that we witness here in New York, that after a while, we are insensitive to our own body burning. Well, with these terrible words.
It's an unfortunate truth that when you leave your house and you go on vacation, and then you come home and your house smells weird, maybe bad, it always smells like that. You're just not used to it.
The olfactory, we know this at the level of receptors, we know it at the olfactory bulb, we know it at the olfactory cortex. The olfactory system adapts very rapidly. What it's really looking for is change. And because of the complexity of detecting olfactory stimuli and how many are out there, if you want to pick something up that's going to be significant to you, you have to adapt out the baseline. Otherwise, it would get completely overwhelmed. So we know adaptation is what you're talking about is adaptation. It's very, very strong. And well, that's why women that wear perfume, for example, tend, as they get older, to put more and more and more on because they can't smell it. And then when you're walking down Madison Avenue, as I was recently, like today, and someone walks by and you just go, oh my God, you know that they've been using that perfume for way too long. So I caught up to her and I said, please change your perfume.
The young men are doing it, why then? Overdosing with cologne?
Even after adaptation, the answer may be no, that'd be great. Even with adaptation, that it still may be having an effect? Is that a possibility?
Well, now you're getting into attention and conflict.
Because you're sitting there and you go, oh yeah, what is that smell? But
Right.
I mean,
it does seem to disappear.
So your neurons know it's there, but there's less response to it in terms of just numbers of spikes and things like that in your neurons.
I sense it goes away. I mean, with sounds, like we've been hearing this little bit of work not far away, we could filter it out, but then if you stop and pay attention, you go, yeah, what is that, right? And I don't find that with sense that it's disappeared.
Yeah. The same thing, you know, we're sitting here and somebody walks in and said, oh, there's a burning smell, and you immediately start sensing it.
Yeah.
So it's a fundamental stuff. I think that olfaction in this respect not different. The environment is slightly different, the stimuli is different, but the principle of adaptation are very much similar, because you ignore the noise, the buzz, the everything. If somebody tells you, oh, you start hearing it.
Yeah.
Similar thing happening.
I mean, there's two processes: adaptation at the level of the receptor, and then habituation as a central brain process. So adaptation, it can't have an effect anymore because you just kind of tire out the sensory neurons and they don't fire that much anymore. But habituation is more that thing when you direct the attention to it again, then it's there again. It's like the ticking clock in a room. You know, you hear it when you first come in, then it goes away, but if somebody says that clock is loud, it comes right back. So it's two different processes.
I mean, I can't direct my attention to the smell of our house in the summer, because we get the sort of very humid Kentucky summers, and the basement sort of will start, and then I'll go away, and I'll come back and have that experience thinking, oh God, what's going to happen when we have to sell this? We'll sell it not in the summer. But yeah, that's right. But I can't direct my attention back to it once I'm home for a while. Yeah.
I think we keep sort of dancing around this today, but I continue to think during the talk about the imprints that scents, odors make on our memory. I mean, for years, if I smelled Ralph Lauren Polo cologne right back to my senior prom. It's probably just because it's not in fashion anymore that I don't recall that. But I would give a more complex example of the training for sommelier, or for the training for these noses in the perfume houses. And they make it very romantic that these noses are just sort of divined somehow to do this work. But in fact, they've probably grown. A lot of them are family businesses. They've grown up doing this. They've imprinted these scents, these odors in their memory. And I think they just, and that combined with the vocabulary is their profession. And that's sort of what I'm throwing out to the table between the use of memory and trying to do this, whether you're a sommelier or someone who works for Guerlain, you can develop this. And some of the best sommeliers, the first thing you'll hear about them is they have a great memory. And of course, we're assuming that the olfaction is integrally related with the taste.
Yeah, that's the first year of perfumery training, is just recognizing all the raw materials that perfumers use. And then when you know the labels, you recognize them in mixtures, so you can detect them there. So that's really, what's required to do that. That's the most important part. And, when you do smell testing in terms of like how sensitive to smells they are, then there's usually no difference between professional perfumers and other people. When you make them name or recognize smells and mixtures, then they're off the charts better, because that's what they've been training and working for.
By the way, this is sort of built into our culture. So the reason that you have ginger in sushi is because you're supposed to have the ginger between eating the different sushis. And the reason is that resets, in some sense, it resets your palate, your olfactory system back so that you can actually taste the difference in the next one. So this kind of thing, we have a knowledge of this. I write books now, and the last book I'm going to write is titled What Science Has Told Us That We Already Knew. And this is one of them.
I have a lot of wine tastings, and I'm standing next to people who have done it before, and they're just speechless. You need the vocabulary, you need the experience, you need to have developed it. And there's no difference. They can do it. They like it.
I actually kind of would like to challenge a little bit this notion about the connection of the smell to the memory. We all kind of like this idea that you smell something, it immediately brings you to the prom, or you smell the kitchen of your grandmother, classical examples. I wonder if I show you the picture of the same thing, you have the same emotional response. My difference is that probably, and that's I'm going to the field that I'm not an expert, so maybe somebody who thinks about it from the human perspective, it's partially because you don't verbalize it, you don't have a language. When you smell something, you cannot verbalize it, it immediately brings you some emotional memory. Oh, this is my grandmother kitchen, but if I show you the grandmother kitchen table, oh, this is a table, you internally verbalize it, and then you go to the memory. So probably that's why we think that olfaction is so close to the memory, because of the lack of the language.
I'll sooner smell a particular impressionistic painting than it will have made some sort of impression on me, in terms of the first time I saw it, or where I was when I saw it. That visual thing doesn't correspond with that same memory experience.
Maybe.
I think the theory is that the olfactory-induced memories are more vivid because of the connection to emotion. Like emotional memories are vivid, right? If you remember back a car crash or your wedding, it's very detailed and vivid. Those details are probably wrong, but they're there in your memory. And because kind of like similar brain structures and processes are used for smell, there's also an extra vividness to those smell memories. But it's extremely difficult to test that in an experiment.
That's exactly my point, that we don't have experimental data.
So you don't feel personally that you have vivid smell memory.
Well, there's also the lack of accessibility. It's not that often someone's going to walk by and go, oh yeah, I got this photo of your grandmother's kitchen.
Exactly.
Well,
Whereas a smell, you might have that smell. It's a little bit more.
I think they're interesting, and I've been thinking a lot about this question a lot lately, but I think they're interesting, or at least some of them are interesting insofar as they sort of take you back to a location in a significant sense. And maybe that's loaded with emotion, but when I experience those things, it's often that I'm taken to a place, and very, and not necessarily very particular, there's not a lot of detail, but it's like a broad location, sort of like my childhood home, or, a certain country, or so on and so forth, with vegetation in a certain way. And so that's why I think they're so striking at times for me, because you're not actually there, but you feel as if in a significant sense you are there. And so, I don't know, I mean, I'd have to look at the empirical stuff about this and what others say about it, but at least, I mean, and you can't really, it's not really good to argue out from your own case and just say this is the way it is, but for me at least, they are striking because of that sense of place. And not necessarily because of the emotional content.
So this is another this is a 2-hour lecture I can't give and you don't want to hear.
Okay.
But the hippocampus, which many people think is a generic memory space, is actually a mapping space.
Yeah.
And the hippocampus is very close. And the argument, and this is a long thing I don't want to go into, is that in finding food, right, which is one of the things the olfactory system is definitely involved in doing. One of the things you need is spatial mapping to find the location of the fruit tree, okay? So I actually think that the mammalian hippocampus is also derived from the olfactory system to provide that mapping. So I think your perception that it's the spatial location that you get transformed to is very perceptive and very deep about how the hippocampus works and how it works with respect to the olfactory system, and how both of them developed in a particular ecological, selection environment.
And this would be a case of a kind of illusion too, because the thing is so weird or striking or whatever word you want to use about those kinds of experiences is the fact that you're not there. So for me, it's never been about sort of, if it's, my childhood home, might be a bit of emotion, but mostly it's like, there is the initial thought.
Yeah, by the way, 95% of the people who study the hippocampus use the alcohol to get rid of the odors before they do it. And if you ask them, why are you doing that? They say, because I can't make sense of the neural signals unless we get rid of the odors. And then you say, well, but you're turning the animal into something it isn't. And you want to figure out how something that isn't a real animal works, go right ahead. But I'd rather not.
I want to welcome this question about memory because fundamentally it's historical, right? Fundamentally it's a historical question. And I work on the sensory history of natural disasters, such as hurricanes, tsunamis. And depending where you are, obviously, there are 2 sensory signatures for recovery from hurricanes, especially in the American South. It's the sound of the chainsaw, and it's the smell of diesel from generators, and sewage, which backs up. And those are the things that trigger memories about environmental disasters. Just like the 9/11 example, they're extraordinarily powerful, but they're always historical, right? Always historical.
Hi, I'm just an avatar for the YouTube comments and questions. So we have 2, one of which I'll kind of add my own additions to, or sort of flesh it out. So the first question is from Eve Harmon. Thank you, Eve, for writing this in. So they wrote, years ago, I lived in Taiwan and learned that Chinese people are often repulsed by the way non-Chinese smell. I thought maybe diet-related, but maybe genetics. So obviously it ties into what we sort of heard today about certain elements of genetics, and also with the onion guy and other smells at concerts that people have visited. And so the other thing I was thinking of is this just another chicken versus the egg situation of genes versus diet? Like, how would you rank those two? And the further dimension I'll add is that within diet, do you think it's just a self-fulfilling epigenetic phenomenon? I guess to flesh it out, I mean, like, you have groups of people eating the same diet, and given any genetic changes that arrive from eating that diet won't necessarily lead to germ cells being mutated. Is it just because the groups of people eat the same food, it's just leading to the same genetic changes generation by generation?
So, I was much happier when we all thought Lamarck was nonsense, frankly. Although I always thought that was wrong, personally, that there was some sense in which we can acquire traits.
Well, but also diets over centuries. There's some cultures where the diets have been distinct for many centuries.
Diet is fascinating for a bunch of great reasons, especially because real diets are designed to give your body the right chemistry. And in the United States, where we eat Thai one day and Italian the next day and whatever, it's a problem. But the other thing that ties into, and it again goes back to this metabolic idea, is one of the big changes in science in the last 10 years is our understanding of the biome. And so one of the things that doesn't come up here at all is how much olfactory detection is actually a consequence of detecting the microbes that are actually involved. And that turns out to change the way you think about things as well. If you're detecting metabolic pathways, what you're really doing is detecting the microbes that are operating on the sewer and the whatever else. So, but I don't. Maybe you want to take on epigenetics in this case.
Look, humans are only one species that we're discussing. Actually, biology has a huge evolutionary history, and if you think about it, olfaction didn't evolve for sommelier or enjoying very, very fancy food. It enjoyed basically to communication among species. And actually smell, are you from my tribe or from a foreigner? Are you eating the same food? Actually, food preferences are huge. So actually animals smell another animal to know what to eat. That's a very known phenomena in biology, kind of transmission of the food preferences. And we, as another biological creatures, inherited a lot of all this stuff, maybe subconsciously. And that's, I think, the biology of our olfactory system tells us, we have sensitivity to diet, to this, to different, culture, to different environment. But it all comes way before, humans comes to play. And also, previously, the modern hygiene started, 100 years ago, maybe 200 years ago. Before, we just were smelly creatures, and our noses get kind of information from that. And I think what you're asking is, yes, you consciously, subconsciously can smell your diet.
Okay. So the next one is from Science Cathedral. Thank you, Science Cathedral. I guess this relates to the previous question about memory, but they wrote, is there varied preferences of smell related to our childhood memories?
Childhood experience, absolutely. Memories, that's what I said. I mean, by the way, when was chemical sense the most important in living systems? It was actually in the first cells 4.6 billion years ago. So chemical sense has been around as a fundamental feature of how biological systems work since the first cells formed. So it is really fundamental to how biology works. We think of it in terms of smell and taste and vision and stuff, but if you really want to understand biology, you've got to understand chemical sense, because that's kind of what it's all about at a base. But yeah, Alfredo Fontanini, if you they can look at some of his work showing how exposure as a young person to different types of foods changes the way you perceive food later. So it is an important thing.
Great.
Can I ask one more question? I don't mean to hog it, but I have one more on my own, not from YouTube. This is more, I guess, looking at history. So, given the talk about how we try to become more odorless, or now with perfume, we try to smell nicer, I sort of thought about a few examples in history. So, Pliny the Elder talked about Tyrian purple and how to make that color, which is generally a sign of luxury or royalty, you would murder or kill thousands of these mollusks that lived in the Eastern Mediterranean to extract their glands to make the purple dye, and it smelled awful. It would take about 1,000 just to make 1 gram of the substance. And then the other example I was thinking about, sort of related, was the Hindenburg was like a transatlantic flight by blimp. They had no showers or anything, so these very rich people would be able to travel from Europe to New York, but they'd smell awful after because they hadn't showered for a week. And then more recently, I thought about the people trying to visit the Titanic. They're in that small tube. I can only imagine what it smelled like before it imploded. But I guess what I'm just asking is, it seems to be, obviously, when you're really rich and have a lot of resources, you're able to do things that go beyond what other people could do. But it still seems to be, no matter what you do, you still can't avoid the fact that you're just going to smell bad. So, is that the last frontier?
Just spend
get
more
out to
time in
space but not
France,
smell bad while we go out to
The great
space.
equalizer.
Well, far be it from me to give you the last frontier on anything, but the point is that it's those people who get to define what smells good. That's what matters. So if they might smell of the Hindenburg and recreate it as, hey, this is the smell of wealth, because I could go across the Atlantic on the Hindenburg. And there are other things besides my body odor. The smell of the food that I ate, the smell of the wine that I ate. That is the olfactory signature of wealth in this particular moment. In other words, it matters who's saying it, and it doesn't have to be provable in a kind of emphatically scientific sense. The words and the person who is articulating those descriptions to whom they're applying has a great deal of weight. And without recognizing that, we are often in danger of repeating some of the mistakes we've made in the past.
So maybe someone here knows, I don't know. I know people that know, but what's the difference between cheap perfume and good perfume? Because I've been told that the difference is that good perfume actually mixes your natural body odor with the perfume, and so it becomes more individualized, whereas cheap perfume just sort of covers you up and makes you smell like something. Do you know? Does anyone know? So I don't think it's only the class says this is the right smell, but my understanding from perfumers that I've talked to is that it's actually the nature of the perfume and how it interacts. They sell it by saying, take this, you don't cover yourself up, you enhance yourself. Mm-hmm. And so I don't know the answer.
I have heard
Do you
the
know?
same from experts, but I don't.
Yeah.
There's probably there might be another example that you can buy just musk. And that's just the raw musk, whatever that is, animal fat or something, and just rub it on yourself or your clothes and it becomes you. But I would extend also, again, a wine example. The most authentic wines are the least manipulated. So possibly by analogy to perfumes, they're the most natural and most organic that in turn take on your scent personality.
And this does, to some extent, filter back to the issues around metabolism of chemicals once they're in contact with you. And so there is some evolution to any compound that gets onto you that's going to be determined in part by your particular body chemistry and whether the metabolites themselves are volatile and so forth.
Well, I think that it was just absolutely an amazing conversation to be a part of, and I want to thank you all of our roundtable members. And I guess I'll close by saying, arrivederci, aroma.
We did a good job.
What's that?
We did a good job.
Oh, amazing. That was like 10 years ago or something.